I think we're going to have a great conversation today. Good morning and welcome to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. My name is Keith Wardrop and I'm the Community Development Research Manager here at the Philadelphia Fed. Again, welcome thank you very much for joining us here. We're very gratified by your presence and excited about this important conversation regarding college promise programs. Some of you may be wondering why the Fed is interested in college promise programs or access to higher education more generally. So I thought I could provide just a little bit of background before we start the formal program. I work in the bank's Community Development Department, and we conduct research and host events like this one on issues affecting low and moderate income communities. We know from research that economic growth is stronger when everyone has a chance to participate, and my department seeks to understand barriers to that participation as well as opportunities to overcome those barriers. We also know research shows that one pathway to economic success is higher education. And the barrier at hand today, the one we're here to talk about, is the difficulty that some lower income and first generation students have in successfully accessing and completing a college degree. And of course, one opportunity to overcome that barrier is the College Promise Program. At the outset, I would like to mention that it's been a pleasure developing the agenda with our co-host, the University of Pennsylvania's Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy, and more specifically with its executive director, Laura Perna. So thank you, Laura. Laura's going to join us on the program later in the day, but I would like to congratulate Laura and Ed Smith on the release of the forthcoming release of an edited volume called Improving Research-Based Knowledge of College Promise Programs. If you'd like to learn more about the book, there's a flyer on the publications table to my left of the room. So my department became directly involved in the issue of access to higher education for lower income students in 2016 when we started a 5-year evaluation of a last dollar financial aid program offered by Rutgers Camden. So it's only fitting that I get to introduce Phoebe Haddon to deliver our opening remarks. Phoebe is not only the chancellor of Rutgers Camden and a strong supporter of the research, but she's also deputy chair of the Philadelphia Fed's board of directors. So please join me in welcoming Phoebe.
Good morning, everyone. Come on. Good morning, everyone. All right. It is really a pleasure to be here in both my roles. And I'd like to welcome all of you who are coming from out of town. This is an extraordinary gathering of talented people focused on the next crisis of America. And I believe it is a crisis, and that is the affordability of a college degree. And when we gather for conversations about higher education, our talk quickly turns to the question of affordability and access. And we know that we're facing a challenging time in terms of even addressing the question of whether a college degree is worth it. It won't surprise you that I am a big proponent of a 4-year college degree and the opportunities that go along with that degree. A 2017 report by the Institute for Higher Education Policy illustrates how increases in college costs are actually hurting less affluent Americans, undercutting our basic ideas of opportunity and fairness. Without retention support and other outreach possibilities, first-gen students simply won't be able to complete their college undergraduate degrees in 4 or 5 or even 6 years. And many drop out even in the last semester of their college experience. And that worries me. I see it at Rutgers Camden. So what we have been trying to do is address those kinds of issues. And costs are certainly a critical aspect of this notion of retention. While students in the highest income quintile can pay for admission at 90% of the institutions surveyed, lower and even moderate income students can afford less than 5% of the institutions that were surveyed. Like many other research universities of our size, our commitment to first gen and to diversity is strong at Rutgers Camden. And social mobility for those students is a real preoccupation for me and the institution, because I believe that enables them to become engaged public citizens. And that is one of my goals in being a leader of an institution like Rutgers-Camden. We know that given the realities of our current social, economic, and political climate, universities have to redouble their commitment to serving the public good. And that means addressing this question of affordability and debt. Our higher education institutions must prepare students for careers after graduation. We also must create leaders and engaged citizens who can interact and understand the democratic process and the principles on which this country was founded. So I believe there are multiple reasons why we have to address the question of affordability. The changing demographics in the United States results in an increasing number of people of color, as you well know, coming into the higher education system, and we must prepare them to serve, we must prepare our institutions to serve their needs. At Rutgers-Camden, our guiding mission as a land-grant institution, historically, is to make a positive impact on our host city of Camden and to impact the overall Delaware Valley region. Our commitment to ensure those who seek access to higher education is a pathway to success for the rest of their lives, and we take very seriously what we are doing in that case. So a little bit of background. We have always been a first-generation student institution. The dynamics of who is a first-generation student these days has changed dramatically across the country, but certainly at Rutgers-Camden. So now our form of access emphasizes the importance of a mission and increasing the commitment for colleges and universities as a whole to the prospect that these students must be able to attain a college degree. I believe the future of higher education depends on its ability to promote a richer understanding of the role in democracy. I'm a lawyer by training, and so that commitment has deep roots for me. It's our public responsibility to provide access to a degree that delivers an education that benefits society, not only for the sake of vocation or goals that an individual student might have, but I think it's a public interest. So when we discuss access, we need to explore what it is that we are providing access to. It's not sufficient to make sure students get in. We must make certain that they are given the tools that will sustain their ability to thrive, to help our society grow once they graduate. Rutgers' commitment to producing creative problem solving is intertwined with our civic learning portfolio. This year, Rutgers-Camden will celebrate the 10th anniversary of our Office of Civic Engagement, and it's something that I'm very, very proud of. It was launched to focus attention on how to apply problem-solving skills that may be a part of an educational institution like Rutgers-Camden, but also to provide those skills to enable us to work with our city of Camden. Our civic engagement commitment is now nationally known by, among others, the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, or CUMU, or AAC&U as well. And these are two organizations that we still have leadership positions in and talk about civic engagement from the standpoint of what we can gather among those kinds of institutions that are committed to this goal. At Rutgers-Camden, learning starts from the precept that all students not only should but must benefit from a deep, hands-on liberal education experience that prepares them to be wholly successful in life. And we think that civic engagement opportunities are ways to make sure that happens. So we incorporate evidence-based practices that engage and challenge our students in the civic engagement program. They experience first-year seminars, intensive writing, opportunities and collaborative projects, internships, learning communities, all the whole 9 yards, but they also are enabled and are supported to do the civic engagement work in Camden. We also have global learning experiences that are experiential in that same respect, and they give opportunities for many students who have never been out of the country, an opportunity to actually see how other people are engaged in problem solving. The civic learning that we embrace is really foundational in terms of our approach from the work of George Koo, the founding director for the National Survey of Student Engagement, because he had found in his research that engaged learning experiences resulted in increased retention, but also opportunity to understand how best to problem solve in many different environments. And he found that this kind of experiential learning was foundational, particularly for first-generation students and students of color. His work also showed that when African American and Latino students with low ACT scores participated in such practices, they actually thrived in terms of their GPAs and other indicators, even more so than some of the other students. Additional research by McNair and Finley showed that even though we know the positive effects of high-impact activities on students, especially first-gen students and students of color, the data shows these students are not necessarily the ones that often get the opportunity to engage in those programs. And so what we have done is to try to make sure that they have those opportunities by really requiring, as part of what they think about in terms of their first year and second, third, and fourth year experiences, fifth year and sixth sometimes, those opportunities to engage in problem solving through civic engagement work. We found that actually our African American students have thrived more so than others in those kinds of courses, and so we encourage everyone to participate. We found that across racial ethnic groups who participate in these high-impact practices, they graduate more quickly than other first-gen students. And I think that that's an important point to emphasize. And the important findings that we have developed that reinforce the concept by the researchers that I've mentioned that show that engaged scholars and students working together can actually do very well. We have actually a role model for thinking about engaged scholars who are students. They include Sandy Stewart, who is our current University of Rutgers as a whole head of the trustees, as well as someone you might be familiar with, Walt McDonald, who is actually the president of ETS. Both of them are our alums, and both have thrived, but they say they have thrived because of the nurturing kind of environment that Rutgers-Camden has provided. And so we see them as enabling us to think more about what we can learn from our previous experiences with students interacting with faculty and keeping that nurturing community approach in the work that we do as we think through what's happening to a more diverse population that we now have on campus. So to give you some example of what that means, we have increased dramatically our first generation students to continue to choose Rutgers-Camden. They look different than they did in 1969 and 1989 as they do it in 2019. But they are clearly connected to this civic activity orientation. And they actually produced 430,000 hours of civic engagement work this past year in Camden. And they work in the city of Camden on a daily basis related to that programming. In the past decade, we've increased the number of our civic engagement learning courses 10 times over. We've quadrupled the number of faculty who are engaged, and I think that's a really important point to make, too. You have to have that engagement, and administrators who are involved in this program. I want to talk about one other aspect of what we do in the couple of minutes that I have, and that's the Bridging the Gap tuition program. We all know about the question of affordability. This program is very simple. We bundle Pell and state tuition aid grants for our students, and those with a family adjusted gross income of less than $60,000 have all of their tuition covered by Rutgers. Those who have AGI of 60 to 80,000 have 75% of the remaining tuition covered, and those of 80,000 to 100,000 AGI have 50% of their tuition covered. This has enabled us to grow, but it's also enabled students not to work extraordinary hours that will disable them from participating in civic engagement and other activities that keep students involved in college and seeing themselves as able to graduate in a 4, 5, or 6-year program. Bridging the Gap is about affordability, but it also has enabled us to dramatically diversify our student population. During the past 2 years, we've welcomed more than twice as many first-generation students, more than twice as many first-year undergraduate Hispanic students, and almost 4 times more first-year undergraduate African-American students. So I'm very proud of the diversity as well as the support given our students through Bridging the Gap. The point is to eliminate or sharply reduce the need for students to work, as I said earlier, but it's also enabling them to carry a full credit load each year so that, and do so successfully. We are part of a longitudinal study of the Federal Reserve Bank presently to see if this can be replicated, or if not strictly speaking replicated, then at least adopted in different ways, adapted to the circumstances of other institutions. I believe it's a national model. We have 2 other programs I just want to mention, and that's for our law school. We have a minority student program that has been extremely successful in producing students who not only get through the law school experience, but also have summer opportunities for employment and ultimately permanent employment through that program. And we have a number of different nursing school programs that also move students from the high school experience through a 4-year college program. So we're committed to providing opportunities for students in many different ways. And we also are doing it in the K through 12 space that I won't talk about unless we have some additional time for questions later. We're a lead entity in the Camden College Access Network, which is focused on the Camden schools, part of our civic engagement. And we are enabling students to have counseling that results in their ability to actually attend our university and others. So the conversation about college access today is very important, and I'm going to stay as long as I can to enable a robust conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chancellor Haddon, and we will hear more about the Fed's research on the Bridging the Gap program during the second panel. In the meantime, though, I'd like to invite the speakers for the first panel to join me at the front of the room. They're going to help us all reach a common understanding of what exactly qualifies as a college promise program, understand how many there are and what we know about their effectiveness for low and moderate income students and first-generation students. If questions arise as you listen to the panel, I would encourage you to submit them using Slido, and you can see some instructions behind me. It's really simple to use. You don't have to download an app. You can go to slido.com, use the code CPP2019, and you can ask questions, ask your own questions. You can also vote on the questions that others have submitted so the moderator can understand which ones are of most importance to those in the audience. Speaking of the moderator, I'm going to turn the mic over to Tiffany Jones, who is the Director of Higher Education Policy at the Education Trust.
Good morning. How's everyone? Good, good. Okay, so I will, just for the sake of time, not take too much time and kind of pivot to our panelists to get us started with a couple of presentations, and just a reminder that we hope that it's an engaging conversation after these presentations. So as you're thinking of questions, please use the Slido tool to pop your questions in, and we look forward to the conversation today. And so just to get us started with the first presentation, we have Elaine, who would like to go first. Okay.
All right, good morning, everyone. Just ready to go. So thanks so much for having me. So I'm a PhD student with Dr. Laura Perna at Penn, and since about 2015, we have done a lot of work to try to understand the landscape of college promise programs, really the variations, how these. Oh, sorry. How these. Oh, yes, thank you. It's on? Okay, I'll stand here then. Sorry about that. So my name is Elaine Lee. I'm a PhD student with Dr. Laura Perna, and we've done a lot of work since 2015 trying to understand the landscape of college promise programs, really how they vary across the country. So this talk is going to be focused not only on giving everyone sort of a lay of the land, what do we understand about promise programs from research, what's some common terminology to make sure that we are all kind of talking the same language about these programs, just to give everyone the same foundation. So, as most of you know, promise programs are being created as we speak and have been for about 10 plus years in many different cities across the U.S., in urban regions, rural regions, really you name it. This movement is really expanding, and not only at the local level, but also nearly half of states have some type of free college program. Normally at the state level, states are promising free community college, so up to 2 years of tuition free. But you can see again that this trend is increasing across the nation. But what in our work, looking at the local programs and the state programs that are across the nation, we know that they're designed in very different ways. They're serving different students. So we really need a common definition of what do we mean by a college promise program. And in our work, we use a three-pronged definition. First, these programs all have a central goal of increasing higher education attainment in the places that they're being started in or in their states. Also, these programs have some sort of financial component, financial award attached to them, beyond existing federal aid and state aid dollars. And the federal aid dollars we're most referring to are Pell Grant dollars that are available for low-income students. So all these programs have some sort of financial incentive. And the key thing with the College Promise movement is also that all these programs have some sort of place-based eligibility criteria. So they're recognizing and wanting to serve students who are maybe living in a certain city or a certain county or attending a certain school district for these to be eligible for these programs in lieu of or sometimes in addition to other sorts of academic or income requirements. So these are really the three key components, the place-based component really being a central part of this College Promise movement. So in our work and in others, there's been efforts to try to organize and understand these different initiatives. So if you want to be able to search all the different kinds of programs that we've collected and organized information on, I would point you to Penn Ahead's searchable database on programs where we include local and state programs. The Upjohn Institute, that does most of the work on the Kalamazoo Promise, also has a searchable database, and they focus more on local programs that have some sort of early targeting component that look much like the Kalamazoo Promise. And then I'll just point to a state resource. So California is the state with the most College Promise programs right now, many at single community colleges. And so the team at WestEd, along with other colleagues, have developed this website as a resource on just California state programs as well. And so again, just to make sure that we are all coming from a common foundation, I want to discuss a few main dimensions that we know that these programs vary across when we look at the number and different types of programs. So often these programs are varying on what they're requiring of students to be eligible for the program, how they're dispensing a financial award, where students can use those programs, so the kinds of institutions and the restrictions on college choice that might be involved in setting up these programs, and whether these programs are targeting students earlier in their high school career or not. So starting with eligibility requirements, you'll often hear programs requiring students to meet at least some combination of these characteristics. So sometimes programs are merit-based and may have some sort of academic criterion that students have to meet, usually with a GPA cutoff, which you can imagine would limit the pool of students. If you have something like a 3.0 cutoff versus a 2.5 cutoff, you're targeting different kinds of students in the program if you have a merit-based component. Then you have programs that may institute a need-based requirement. So usually they are instituting some kind of income cutoff, or at least generally saying they want to serve students with demonstrating some sort of financial need. And of course, then you have programs that have a hybrid. They may have merit-based and need-based requirements to be eligible for their program. Often what's considered the most kind of generous program, or the one that's going to be simplest and clear-cut to students, are universal eligibility programs. So these are different in that they're not requiring students to meet certain academic requirements or certain income requirements. They're essentially saying any student that lives in a certain city or goes to a certain school district can get this award. And so you can imagine that that's pretty clear to families. Hey, I'm graduating from Pittsburgh Public Schools. I can receive this award. That's all you have to do. So there's a bucket of programs that fit that universal category. Another key distinction that needs to be understood in understanding the design and implications of college promise programs is how financial awards are determined. So you will often hear this is a first dollar program versus a last dollar program. And what really is meant by that is a first dollar program, that financial award is awarded to the student first before considering any other federal aid that they might receive or any other state aid. So let's say a student grows up in a certain county and that county is promising all kids get $1,000 when they graduate, and it's a first dollar award. That student is guaranteed that $1,000. They could use it potentially for any costs of college and have their other tuition covered by other Pell dollars if they're eligible, or other state aid. On the flip side, last dollar programs are the most common type of design of college promise programs, mostly due to cost constraints, resource constraints in different communities. And what happens with last dollar programs is that amount of the financial award is calculated after considering the kinds of federal and state aid that a student will receive. So theoretically, a student might be eligible for a partial Pell Grant. They might get some state aid and have maybe $100 left over that needs to be covered for tuition. That last dollar program would be promising, hey, we'll cover that $100. And if you think about it, some students already get all their tuition covered. If you get like a full Pell Grant and you're going to a community college, that's $6,000+. Technically, in a last dollar program, a low-income student who receives full Pell funding may not be a beneficiary of that last dollar program because their tuition has been covered. So there's different trade-offs and constraints in trying to understand these two different models. Not finally, but programs also vary on where students can use their funds. So the most common type of program now cropping up are programs just at one community college. And so you'll see community college only programs. They're promising institutional aid just to attend their institution. And you also see this a little bit at the four-year level, but it's much more common at the community college level. The Rutgers-Camden program is an example of a four-year only type of program. Then, of course, you have programs that are giving a broader set of college choices to students and saying, you can use this award at any 2-year or 4-year college of your choice, but they usually bound that within the state that the student is residing in. And there's a handful of programs that do fit that model as well. And then very rarely, but you do see it if you are looking across the expanse of programs, there are some programs that say, hey, there's no restrictions on your college choices. You can go to any college across the country. You're not limited to the state bounds. And so all these different kinds of rules within the program have implications for where students can attend, right, and the kinds of choices that are available to them. And finally, programs really benefit or vary on where the program benefits begin, when they begin. So you have a chunk of programs that tend to be early targeting or what we call early awareness type of programs. And so this means that there might be some actually tangible supports built into those programs before the student graduates college, maybe in the form of college counseling in middle school and high school if the program has those sorts of resources. More often, early awareness can also mean that the financial award is somehow tied to how long a student is living in a certain area. So if it's an early awareness program, you might get more of that financial award if you have lived in that place since kindergarten versus if you just moved there in high school. And it's a way to incentivize staying or moving into a certain place that has these programs. More often than not, though, at least the trend that we're seeing now, especially with community college type programs, is that these programs are built for high school graduates enrolling directly that fall semester. And so most programs tend to fit this category where it's specifically for that graduating senior and they have to enroll in the fall. But there's more talk and I think more push to have programs that are now offering post-high school, so allowing adults, students that maybe took a break for a year or two, or even more than that, to be eligible for programs. And you're starting to see that trend, or I think people want to see that the movement go in that direction. But there are a few programs that offer the benefit to post-high school grads as well. So given all that variation, I want to very briefly at a very high level go over, well, what do we actually know from research on how college promise programs work? And so there is a building amount of evidence, and researchers tend to look at these things from K-12 outcomes, post-secondary outcomes, and then kind of community and economic development outcomes. But the key caveat to what I'll summarize for you is that a lot of the published research out there is based on just a handful of programs. And we know this movement is growing every day, and there's at least 140, 150 local programs, if not with state programs as well. But a lot of our research is focused on these programs that are listed here that tend to be those early awareness types of programs. They tend to give a broader choice set to students, larger financial awards. Some of them are first dollar programs as well. So it's a very specifically designed type of program that we have evidence on. And you'll learn a little bit more about that with our later panelists. But there's less research done on what's becoming the most common model, the community college only model, one institution starting a promise program at their community college, and even less on four-year programs like the Rutgers-Camden that we'll hear about. So in this table, what I've basically done here, if we look at what do we know from research on K-12 outcomes, you can see, the types of outcomes researchers are interested in. Does the introduction of a promise program in a community raise things like students' high school GPA now that they know that that award is available? Does it raise math and reading scores or potentially high school graduation rates? The plus and minus signs kind of give you a general idea of the direction of effects that are seen in those papers, and then the orange boxes are statistically significant effects that are found in those papers. And what you can see is, at least looking at one program at a time, there may be some positive effects at the K-12 level, but you can see that studying these effects across multiple kinds of programs and multiple cities and multiple contexts, we just don't have a lot of that information. So it's hard to straight out say all promise programs will have these sorts of effects. But again, you can see some of the trending evidence at the K-12 level. I would say that we're starting to see in the research a more robust finding around college enrollment. So you can see across 4 programs that have been assessed on different post-secondary outcomes related to enrollment, persistence, and completion in college. We do see a consistent finding in the literature and statistically significant findings around college enrollment. These programs seem to help increase enrollment in their communities. We don't know quite as much around, how these programs affect persistence, and really less on completion. We know a little bit more about Kalamazoo because it's been around since 2006, so there's been more time to study those effects. But a lot of the research is constrained because a lot of these programs are pretty new, and so students may be just going into college. We haven't seen how far they've completed their paths. And finally, researchers are really interested as well in, well, what actually happens in a community, in a place that's thinking about or instituting a college promise program. And so a lot of communities that are interested in this are also interested in revitalization of their economies, of bringing back people because they've been suffering from depopulation. And so researchers are trying to understand, well, does a promise program help bring more people back through mobility rates? Or we can look at population growth through public school enrollments. And you can see, again, across the different kinds of programs, there's some promising trends around raising population as measured by public school enrollment, a little bit mixed evidence on housing values, and this is all very contextual, but it gives you an idea of what's being studied out there and generally what's starting to be found. So to close, I really just wanted to pose a few critical questions that I think should be in our minds as we continue the conversation throughout the day about the potential of college promise programs to do many different things around affordability issues, completion issues, community revitalization issues. And so the first set are really around college access. If we want these programs to succeed, we need to first understand, well, how are students and families even learning about these programs? How is this being messaged to the community? And is it being messaged in really equitable ways? You also need to think about if you're designing programs or want to fund or start these programs, what do students have to do to be eligible? How many hoops do they have to jump through? And when does that become a barrier to more students receiving the benefit of this promise? Evaluations also need to be done on which students will most likely be the recipients of those programs in a community as well. If we want to tackle affordability issues, we also need to understand, well, if it's a first dollar or last dollar program, how much can we actually afford to cover for each student? What is that financial award going to cover? What's not going to be covered? Is that going to be really helpful for our goals or not? And certainly there's other costs and benefits that have to be thought about, but that's a key question around affordability. Around completion, if we want these programs to also facilitate college completion, we need to think about, well, where can students use these awards? There's some concern out there that, with the widespread amount of community college awards, is that changing students' college choices who would have otherwise gone to a four-year college, going to a community college, right? That's an active question out there. But there's also benefits to just having a widespread message that you can go to college and this is available. But where students are constrained choice-wise is important to consider, as well as what other supports are there in the programs. Is it just a financial benefit, or are there other things that the institutions or the community is doing to facilitate students understanding all the different requirements that are needed to go to college and complete college? And finally, I think the big question in our head is sustainability. In the communities, in the states that these programs are starting in, how politically and financially sustainable are these programs in the long run? We don't want to start a program in a community where you can't keep that promise. So how do we actually make this work for so many different kinds of communities facing so many kinds of needs? So with that, I'll leave it to the next panels. Thanks.
Oh, what did I do? Shoot. I think I have advanced it to the next. Thank you.
There you go.
So hi all, can everyone hear me? Good, okay, great. So my name is Meredith Billings. I am a postdoc at the University of Georgia. Thank you, Elaine, for that great overview of Promise programs. So right now I'm going to narrow it down to look at one state of Promise programs. So there's about 20 different Promise programs in Michigan. I am going to talk about 9 out of those 20 or so programs. One of those programs is the Kalamazoo Promise, which we've been hearing about a lot, and I'm sure you're probably fairly familiar with. The other set of programs are the Promise Zones, and they are different from the Kalamazoo Promise in that they were designated by the state, and they have very different design elements compared to the Kalamazoo Promise. If you are familiar with Michigan, I took some liberties about where the stars are, so trying to be more like stylistic so you can see it, but yeah, so okay. So like I said, the Kalamazoo Promise, it started in November of 2005. There was a group of anonymous donors that pledged up to 100% of tuition and fees all the way up to a bachelor's degree. This got wide attention across the nation. There was a media frenzy. So the idea of Promise programs and free college kind of spread across the nation, and that led to this like huge Promise program movement. The Michigan Promise Zones were inspired by the Kalamazoo Promise. They were created, though, by a state legislation in January of 2009, and they were targeted towards economically distressed areas. So the areas actually had to apply to the state. So 15 applied and 10 received Promise Zone designation. And so I am going to talk about 8 out of these 10, and that's because they started awarding the scholarships from about 2010 to 2013. And the other thing that's different about the Promise Zones, when it comes to funding, there's a mix of private and public funding, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm happy to talk about during the discussion if you have questions about what that looks like. So just to give you like a general picture of trying to understand what the designs of the Kalamazoo Promise compared to the Michigan Promise Zones. So they are universal in the sense that it's only resident criteria. So you have to live within either the Kalamazoo public school system, or you have to live within the boundaries of the Promise Zones. And depending upon where you enter or when you enter the public school system is what % of the scholarship that you're eligible for. The Promise Zones, the 10 of them, there's a lot of different variation within each of the Promise Zones because they looked at the state legislation and then they created their own eligibility criteria depending upon their local context and their goals. I try to distill down to it kind of like the main points, but I'd be happy to talk about more about what that variation is and what that looks like. The main thing to understand between the Kalamazoo Promise and the Promise Zones are that the Kalamazoo Promise is up to a bachelor's degree, while the Promise Zones are really only focused on the associate's degree level. The Kalamazoo Promise is a first dollar scholarship. So students who are eligible for need-based aid are going to get more aid than they would have gotten otherwise without the scholarship, where the Promise Zones are a last dollar scholarship. So talking with people in the Promise Zones, since a lot of their students are eligible for the Pell Grant, sometimes they think of the Promise Zones more as an informational wrapper because students are not getting more money than they would have otherwise gotten. It kind of helps distill information about how to apply to college in a simpler package than they might otherwise have gotten. And then the big difference is the Kalamazoo Promise. They can go to any Michigan public college or university. And then starting with the class of 2015, they also can go to some of the Michigan private institutions. For the Promise Zones, though, usually it's focused at the local community college, and some of them expand to other options. But what they do is like they cap it at whatever the local community college tuition rate is. So you might be able to go to a four-year institution, but you're only going to get the tuition rate or the amount of money up to what you would have received at a community college. So you could think about that might only be like $2,000 or $3,000 for a scholarship. So I'm just going to talk about a little bit about my research, about what I am seeing for some of the effects of the eligibility. So I was looking at what is the effect of students being eligible for these programs. So for the Kalamazoo, I just wanted to show you the outcomes for college enrollment and degree completion. The other major critique of the Promise programs is that students who are more advantaged within the school districts are the ones that are able to benefit from these scholarships. So I wanted to show you some student subgroup analysis compared to the Kalamazoo Promise. For the Michigan Promise Zones, I'm going to show you college enrollment. They haven't really been around long enough to show you degree completion. So what I'm going to do is show you persistence to the second year of college. So my research design for both of these programs is I'm comparing students in either Kalamazoo or the Michigan Promise Zones before and after the program started awarding scholarships. And then I'm looking at a set of poor urban school districts from across the state that are similar either to the Kalamazoo school district or similar to the Promise Zone school districts. And then I'm again looking before and after they started awarding scholarships. So right here I'm showing you Kalamazoo in red, and I compare them to 7 poor urban school districts from across the state. For the Michigan Promise Zones, there's 8 of them, also in red, and I'm comparing them to 13 poor urban school districts from across the state. So the great thing about these designs is that you can graph them. So for the Kalamazoo, what you're seeing along the horizontal axis is the cohorts. To the left of the red line, you're seeing the pre-promise cohorts. So those are the students that graduated high school and the Kalamazoo Promise had not existed yet. And then you'll see students, so to the right of the red line is the what we call the post-promise cohorts. So those are the students that graduated from high school and the Promise program was awarding scholarships. So this is showing you kind of the mean college enrollment over time for the Kalamazoo public school system students. They're in the gray diamond, and then the poor urban school districts are in the black circle. So with this design, what we see is there's about a 10 percentage point increase in college enrollment for students that are eligible for the Kalamazoo Promise. If we look to the Promise Zones and look at enrollment in college, so the x-axis looks a little, that's the horizontal axis, looks a little bit different because the Promise Zones started in several different years. So what you're seeing, that red line is showing you, so I had to like collapse them all together. So you're not seeing specific years, but what you are seeing is the year before the scholarship got started and the years after the scholarships got started. So in this case, I'm also still looking at the mean college enrollment within 1 year of expected high school graduation. So we are seeing a positive point estimate of 4.5 percentage point increase. Unfortunately, the estimate is fairly noisy. So what that means is because what we would say the range around this point estimate is so large, I'm not able to say that it's statistically significant from zero. I also wanted to show you degree completion and persistence. So for the Kalamazoo Promise for degree completion, and in this time, if you look across the x-axis, what you'll see or what you'll notice is one of several of the cohorts kind of dropped out. And this is because I'm looking within 6 years of their expected high school graduation to see whether they had a degree. And we just don't have information. I think a lot of this is kind of a time crunch where you have to kind of wait until cohorts of students kind of move through the system to be able to really evaluate some of these longer term effects. So for degree completion, I'm only seeing 3 cohorts of students. And if you remember, just to let you know that these 3 cohorts were in high school when the Kalamazoo Promise was announced. And so we can also talk about there's some like short-term effects and some longer-term effects about thinking about the theory of change in these school districts and in these places. And so if you're in high school when a Promise program is announced, that's probably going to look really different about some of the behaviors that you would do as opposed to if you were in middle school when the Promise program is announced. However, for degree completion, I am still seeing some positive effects. So there's a 5 percentage point increase for students that were eligible for the Kalamazoo Promise. If we look over to the Promise zones for persistence to the second year of college, I'm also seeing another positive point estimate, about a 3.5 percentage point increase for students that are eligible for the Promise Zone scholarships. However, similarly to the enrollment estimates, they're just very large. Confidence intervals, what we think of like the range around that point estimate. So I can't say it's like statistically different from zero. And then I think one of the main interesting results about the Kalamazoo Promise and some of the things that with research and as we're designing programs that we really need to think about, like who is benefiting from these scholarship programs. So what I did for the Kalamazoo Promise is I compared white and Asian students to Black and Latino students, as well as students that were economically disadvantaged in 8th grade compared to not economically disadvantaged. All that really means is whether they were eligible for free and reduced price lunch in 8th grade. And so if you look across that row for enrolling in any college within 1 year of expected high school graduation, so you're seeing like very strong positive effects for across the student subgroups for enrolling in college. I think what we need to think about as a group when you go down and look at earning any degree within 6 years of expected high school graduation, that's where you really start to see differences between the student subgroups. So you'll see white and Asian students as well as those that are not economically disadvantaged have fairly strong positive effects on degree completion. However, Black and Latino, as well as those that are economically disadvantaged, either have negative or kind of very modest positive effects. And since they're not statistically significant, what that is also telling us is they're not really doing any better than the students in that poor urban school districts, those comparison school districts. And I'm happy to talk more about why I think this is going on during the discussion. Just to give you some wrap up and some main takeaways and some next steps. So we do see that there are some strong positive effects for the Kalamazoo Promise. However, Black, Latino, and poor students are not experiencing those same strong positive effects on degree completion as their white, Asian, and non-poor counterparts. You should, though, remember that these are the 3 cohorts of students that were in high school when the Kalamazoo Promise was announced. So hopefully when we think about theories of change and as more students coming through the pipeline, that we would like to see that narrow and not to be such a stark difference. Some of the next steps, though, as we can think about as a group, if some students are not getting their degrees, we need to figure out why is that so? So we could look at what kind of courses are they taking when they get to college? Do they need to take a lot of remedial courses? Is that what's going on about why they're not getting their degree? What type of institutions are these students attending? And are they remaining eligible for the scholarship for year to year? For the main takeaways and next steps for the Michigan Promise Zones, unfortunately, what I can say is there are positive point estimates, so that's good. However, they're just not estimated precisely enough that you really want to hang your hat on at this point in time. So what could happen is more cohorts to go through, doing some more evaluation and analysis of those programs. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be positive point estimates at the end of the day, but hopefully they will be estimated precisely enough to see that there is a statistically significant effect or not. Some of the next steps for the promise zones is thinking about if they're just this informational wrapper and it's really not about the scholarship, how can they kind of leverage their community resources? When are students being made aware of the scholarship? And then also thinking about the promise zones in general. If you think back to that design slide that I was talking about, they were really set up for really large impacts like the Kalamazoo Promise was. So with that, I will conclude and thank you so much and happy to talk more about this at the break or during the discussion.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Alyssa Ratledge, and I am a research analyst at MDRC. For those of you who are not familiar with MDRC, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and we do a lot of rigorous evaluations, such as randomized control trials and quasi-experimental evaluations of social programs in a number of fields: welfare, housing, prison anti-recidivism, early childhood education, K-12 education, and my department focuses on post-secondary education, with a particular focus on the types of institutions that serve our country's historically underrepresented and currently disadvantaged populations. So that's community colleges, technical colleges, HBCUs, really those colleges who are disproportionately serving that population. So we at MDRC think a lot about promise programs, really thinking about some of the concerns that Elaine, Meredith, and others have raised around things like equity, thinking about who they're serving, how they're structured, how they can be designed better, and also how they can serve the dual goals of access and success. So promise programs traditionally really focused on college access. How can we get more students into college, which is a fantastic goal, a really laudable goal. We know that we need more students to enter college. But if those programs are not also helping students be successful once they're there, we're not really getting to the program's goal of getting students to graduation, getting them to a family-sustaining wage, right? The goal of a program is never to get a student to step foot in the college in September after they graduate from high school. The goal is to get them graduated into a career with a family-sustaining wage. And when we look at the data about how students are doing in college, we really focus our efforts on the success side. And I'll give you an example of why. So these data are pulled from the 2016 publication from the Department of Ed and look at students who start at public two-year institutions. So that's essentially community and technical colleges. You'll see that 3 years after matriculating, so that's 150% of the typical time to an associate's degree, only 14% of students have graduated. 44% are still enrolled or may have transferred to another college. So that can be good or bad. It could mean they're just taking extra time. It could mean they've transferred to a 4-year and they're looking at a baccalaureate degree, which is great. But 42% are not enrolled anywhere. And that's really staggering. 42% are not enrolled anywhere and have no degree. So we've identified, and the research literature has identified, several different problems that cause this. These might be academic challenges, as Meredith mentioned. A lot of students, especially who are coming from low-income areas of the country, have to complete remedial courses once they've enrolled. There are financial barriers, which Promise programs take a look at, although students may face other issues such as the cost of books, transportation, the opportunity cost of being in college instead of working full-time. Students struggling with a work-life school balance, especially for students who are parents themselves or responsible for taking care of family members. A lack of college know-how, which is especially pronounced for first-generation students. You'll see in our work later, we do a lot of work with first-generation students, and a lot of them really have no idea what to do once they get on campus and don't have anyone in their immediate family that they can turn to for advice. And then finally, a lot of students face institutional barriers. For those of you who are familiar with the guided pathways model, this is really speaking to that. You know, students might need to take courses for their major that are not offered every semester. How are they going to handle that? Well, all of a sudden they're at a semester, they have no classes to take. So, like I mentioned earlier, we really think about the dual goals of both access to college and success once they're there. And we've been working with a number of College Promise programs across the country to build programs that do both of those things. So we've worked with a number of different Promise programs across the country. They're listed here. And these are programs who have a Promise scholarship in place, but really are not seeing the kinds of completion rates that they wanted to be seeing. And we started working together with the goal of developing additional supports or changing their program design or making changes that really would support students to not only arrive in college, but persist and eventually get to a credential. I'm going to focus today mostly on the Detroit Promise path, and the reason is that we have done a randomized control trial to evaluate the new program. But what I'm going to talk about, I think, is broadly applicable across all of those Promise programs that I mentioned earlier, and happy to talk more about the details when we get to the discussion portion. So the Detroit Promise is a pretty typical College Promise program in that it offers students a last dollar tuition and fee scholarship for students who are from the city of Detroit, graduate from a Detroit high school, and then enter one of 5 area community colleges. So the community college district that's in the city of Detroit, as well as 4 others in the suburbs and surrounding areas. The program has since expanded to a couple of 4-year universities, but for our study, we looked just at community college students. So the scholarship had been around for several years, and the Detroit Regional Chamber, who administers the program, observed that more students seemed to be coming from high school into college, but less than half of students were still enrolled in school as of their second year. So the numbers were just a staggering drop between the first year and the second year. And they said, we hear from students that they're facing a lot of these issues. This is a predominantly low income, predominantly first generation population. They don't know what to do on campus. Almost all of our students are working. They often are not getting support at home or in the community for taking time in college instead of working. So we want to do some additional work to help support these students. So we partnered with the Detroit Promise Path to design some additional program components based on the research literature of what works for this particular population of students. The biggest piece is that we created campus coach positions. So these are distinct from academic advisors. They take more of a holistic view on how a student is doing, what other responsibilities that student faces outside of school, how they can be successful within the school. So a common exercise they'll do with students is, how do you talk to a faculty member at office hours? Something I think many of us were intimidated by, thinking back to our freshman year of college. But for these students, it can be especially problematic because they don't really know anyone on campus. They don't know who to talk to in their family about this. Many of them are coming from predominantly Black high schools and going into predominantly white colleges, facing stereotype threat. So really helping students with all of those different things. Some of them may also be as simple as, I know that you need to go talk to an academic advisor. I'm going to walk you over there to dispel some of this stigma, get students to actually act on it. So really providing those additional supports that traditionally college campuses do not provide. Students who participate in the program and meet with their coach as directed twice per month are eligible to get $50 a month. This is a pretty typical behavioral science paid financial incentive. We hear from students that they mostly spend it on transportation and food, so that gives you a sense of what kind of population of students we're working with, that one of the big things that they're facing on campus is food insecurity. In addition, students continue to be engaged by the program throughout the summer. So they're either offered summer classes paid for by the program, connecting them to local summer jobs program, and their coaches continue to reach out to them. So really figuring out, okay, if you've completed 2 semesters, we don't want you to disappear over the summer. We want you to be engaged in something productive. And finally, the program uses a management information system to keep track of student participation. So this means both saying, okay, who have I seen this month, but also who have I not seen? Who have I not heard from? I want to send a text message to all the students who haven't registered for next semester or who haven't completed their FAFSA yet, really continuing to meet students where they are and help support them along the way. So our randomized control trial took a look at students in fall 2016 and fall 2017. Random assignment was used because the program did not have enough funding to offer spots to all students. So using a lottery essentially is a fair way to give those spots out, not just giving them to the students who first show up, first come, first serve, but also students who show up the day before school starts who arguably need that help even more. And as a note, our study is comparing the new program to the scholarship alone. So control group students continue to receive the Detroit Promise Scholarship. This is a test just of these additional supports. You can see that this is a very high poverty population. We look at things like free and reduced price lunch, which is very high, Pell Grant receipt, which is very high. About 75 to 80% of students identify as first generation, don't live with a parent who's earned a bachelor's degree. It is a predominantly female population. Most of the students are coming right out of high school, and the vast majority of our students identify as students of color. So I'll give you a chance to check these graphs out. So the program group, so that's our group receiving the Detroit Promise Path, the additional supports. Those are the dark blue bars. The lighter blue bars are the control group. So that's students who are still able to receive the scholarship offer, but are not getting any of that outreach from the coach. And you can see that we see pretty large and statistically significant impacts on enrollment rates. In fact, these second semester enrollment rates are among the highest that we at MDRC have seen in randomized control trials. So you're really seeing that the program is keeping more students in school, and it's also keeping them enrolled full-time. Full-time enrollment is important because it correlates with students' likelihood of persisting and getting to a degree. And what's interesting about this is that the program nominally requires students to enroll full-time, although students aren't really penalized if they drop below full-time status. So what you can see is if students are given that direction, they're not able to do it, this program is helping more of those students stay in school full-time. Okay. You'll also see that we have a very large impact on summer enrollment, almost tripling the number of students who enroll in school in the summer, which is really encouraging because there is burgeoning research literature around summer enrollment, academic momentum, keeping students up. It's also a way for students to complete remedial courses in a non-fall spring semester to get those out of the way. So this is really encouraging. Finally, we see that in their first year, students are twice as likely to complete a full-time course load. So if you think back, the program nominally requires students to enroll full-time, and you can see that there are really large impacts here on students' likelihood of doing that. And related, a much lower number of students received 0 credits. Qualitatively, we hear from students that they really value the program, that it's something that really matters to them. In particular, the coaching component, helping them out with that coaching, that advice, someone to go to on campus is extremely beneficial. In a survey, we found that students were more likely to report that they understood college processes, which for a first-generation population is pivotal for their success. We, however, did find that students continued to have a lot of financial challenges, and when it came down to why students were no longer enrolled in school, by far the most common reason was that they faced financial issues. Almost all of our students said that they need to work to support themselves and their families. Many students reported that they had experienced food or housing insecurity along the way. And again, many of these students said that when it came to issues like food and housing insecurity, they simply could not justify staying in college when they needed to work to support their families. So we really see this as a way that there's a lot more work to do in supporting these students, but it's something that we want to continue to do. So we'll get into the conversation in a minute, but there's a couple things I want to flag for everyone coming out of both Detroit and the other College Promise Success Initiative programs that we've worked with. So one harkens back to what my co-presenters have said. Program design really matters. If you think about how to get students to enroll full-time or enroll part-time, for state programs, we are seeing a lot of shuffling of students, and one thing you want to think about if you are offering a program is, are you incentivizing students who would have gone to a 4-year to go to a 2-year instead? And how does college matching play into the incentives that you're creating? Meredith alluded to this earlier, but one of the critiques of College Promise programs is that for some students, especially higher income students, this can be a windfall. You're essentially saying to students who are already receiving full Pell, you can now go to college, which does have some benefits. There are plenty of students who would receive full Pell who don't know that. So there's a real benefit to reducing their financial anxiety because you're telling them something they don't know about their eligibility. But at the same time, for programs that serve all students, this can be a windfall for students whose families are able to pay, which can be expensive. Another thing we found is how you think about the simplicity of the program can have some big costs associated with it. So one example on the front side is thinking about eligibility criteria. If you have really complex eligibility criteria that requires a transcript read, which is a thing some College Promise programs require, you essentially have to hire a staff person to read everyone's transcripts. That's a big expense. And what is it really accomplishing? Well, it's making it more confusing for students. On the other side, some statewide programs, as you may know, have instituted requirements that students must stay in the state for a certain number of years after receiving the program, or it converts from a grant to a loan. Who's going to check that? That's a whole staff person's time to do all that checking, and what are you really accomplishing? That actually brings us into some of the things I want to flag that we don't know, and one is, are beneficiaries staying in the same city, state, or region? If we think about these as economic development programs, is that happening? That'll be really interesting to look at. Are the beneficiaries making family supporting wages? That's our end goal. And then most importantly, in our view, is are these programs being designed to support particular subpopulations of students, particularly low-income students, first-generation students, and even more so now, adult students? Do these students need different kinds of supports, different kinds of structures? Can they go full-time or part-time? Can they go in alternative semesters like summer? Those are all things that we need to be thinking about and really encourage our programs to be collecting data on so that we know whether this is something that is a windfall, is disproportionately serving particular students, is exacerbating achievement gaps, the things that we don't want to see happen. So I will leave it with that. Happy to talk more about this, and I know Tiffany has some great questions to guide us. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you to the panelists for these enlightening presentations. For the sake of time, I won't talk too long. I'll let us jump right into the questions and answers, especially those of you who have questions on your mind. Just want to encourage you one more time to enter them in using the Slido tool, and we're happy to jump in with those questions and prioritize them. But I have some in the event that you don't as well. But I just want to say a couple of things. So I direct the higher education policy work at the Education Trust, and we're a policy and advocacy organization that focuses on creating opportunities for low-income students and students of color all across the educational pipeline, from early education through higher ed. And when I joined the organization back in 2016, we were getting a lot of questions about this free college idea. Is this good? Is it good for equity? Especially because you had presidential candidates running and this was a part of their platforms, and folks wanted to know what to think about it, from the media to staff who are working with elected officials. And so for us, we wanted to provide a thoughtful response. Most often it depends, which is well in line with what the panelists shared today. But I do want to make clear our messaging back was always about, we have a big problem in terms of the affordability crisis that will require big solutions, bold solutions. And so we were pleased to see bold solutions like free college, like college promise programs on the table, because it's going to require some big systemic changes to fix the problems that we have in front of us. But the biggest question that remained unanswered for us is, but does this help solve the affordability crisis for the students who struggle the most to pay? And so for us, we took an opportunity to try to apply some of the criteria that the panelists shared today around looking at the design. What does it cover? Who does it cover? Are there some of these criteria that might have a disproportionate impact on low-income students and students of color, like certain GPA requirements, like having to stay in the state and being penalized? And in any case, does it ever turn from a grant into a loan? And that really mattered to us, because what we did see on the bright side, or the potential side with College Promise, is the power of the messaging, the power of being able to tell low-income students that college is an opportunity for them if they're so interested, because we're going to remove the cost barrier for you. And so once you undermine that by converting, from a grant to a loan, you really have created quite a problem for low-income students. And so for those reasons, we started to get more and more involved in the conversation and try to read a lot of the work that these folks are doing, a lot of the folks in the audience are doing as well, to become informed. But again, we're so pleased to see that this idea of doing something big to solve the affordability crisis has momentum, and we think that's really promising. And the best thing that we can do in regards to how it can have a positive impact on equity is try to learn from what's happening already. And I think a lot of the local programs like the panelists discussed today provide us with evidence around what impact it's having already on particular students overall, but especially for low-income students and students of color. So with that, I want to open us up with kind of the panelists. You all have taken a look at these programs and their criteria. One kind of research question is, what are the unanswered questions? If you could identify one question that really needs to be answered to help inform the kind of free college promise discussion. And then if there are any barriers to answering those research questions, could you kind of talk about what some of those might be? And feel free to jump in, anyone.
I'll jump in first. All right, so, I think there's a lot of them. I still feel like from a researcher standpoint, this is a very new area to be researching in, even though I think the level and the quality of research is steadily improving. I think we are starting to know a little bit more about kind of the short-term effects of promise programs, right? Is there an immediate effect on college enrollment, or, that eligible high school student and what happens the next year in high school or something like that. But we don't know a lot about the long-term effects. And, to get to that, part of it is frustrating, is just time has to go by and that data has to be collected. But that can't be emphasized enough, the quality of data and the way that these programs are set up to put resources not only to designing these programs, but either having or creating some of the resources to look at these programs to be evaluated and to provide that quality data that so that you can track student level outcomes for a long term, or create the kinds of partnerships between the program and the universities that might be involved, and other city or county players or state players that have access to that sort of data. Those sorts of pieces and partnerships need to connect if we really want to understand, can this improve different outcomes for students for the long haul? So I would say lots of unanswered questions around persistence, completion, the kinds of programs that students are completing. Is this promoting transfer behaviors? We know almost nothing about that, I would say. All those sorts of pipeline questions are one key aspect.
I totally agree. And I would say an important facet of that, as I mentioned earlier, is the subgroup analysis within it. You know, if we're thinking about these as an economic driver and as an equity driver, we need to understand how these programs disproportionately affect or don't affect other people. You know, when I look at Meredith's really important research, I find it really frightening from an equity perspective, and I think a lot more work needs to be done there to think about how we can thoughtfully design programs so that it's not just a windfall for middle and higher income students. It is something that's going to continue to support lower income, historically underrepresented first-gen students of color as well.
I also am curious about like what is happening at the K through 12 level. I think in education, a lot of times we separate like what happens at college compared to what happens at the K through 12 level. And I think we need to understand, especially in school districts where the majority of students are eligible for these promised scholarships, is that really revitalizing those school districts? Like, how are teachers, how are school counselors getting involved? Are they getting involved? I know that there's been some research around this, but not a lot of research. And so I would just be really curious about like, how do we like dig deep, get into like, you know, K through 12 school districts and kind of understand also like, how is the message getting out there? Like, when exactly are they being targeted? We know that targeting students in 12th grade is like too late, and that's where a lot of these programs are targeting students. And so like, how do we set up so that we're targeting students in middle school, and how do we get the families involved, and how do they understand what the promised scholarships are and what the eligibility criteria are? Some of the barriers, I think, is just access to rigorous data. It's, you know, a lot of the work that I did is because of my advisor had access to K through 12 administrative data across the state, and that's really, really rare. There's a lot of states that either don't really have a longitudinal database or that make it really difficult for people to get access to a longitudinal database to do the kind of rigorous evaluation work of these programs. So that's what I would say, just like getting access to like really quality data is difficult to evaluate some of these programs.
Thank you. So the audience wants to talk politics. And a question that has the most votes is around the political side, right? Unfortunately, we don't always make policy just based on what the research says to do. And so folks want to hear more about kind of any work that anyone's doing or research that exists that takes a look at the political side of kind of free college or college promise programs and their popularity, especially those that have very little restrictions in terms of, you know, those that have a more universal design. And is there anyone who could kind of weigh in terms of what you're seeing in the research that exists, or even in some of the tensions between the research that exists on kind of the impact these policies are having and kind of what we're seeing in terms of what has political momentum?
I normally field this question to Martha, who is here. I think when you look at the municipal and state level, there have been bipartisan support. There have certainly been blue and red states who have implemented these kinds of programs. One of the things, if you think from a political standpoint, You can think about Democrats being more likely to support programs that are focused on equity and low-income students. Republicans have been really supportive of workforce-focused promise programs and adult promise programs. I can think, for instance, of the big Indiana programs that are happening right now, which have huge support from Republicans in that state. So I think there's different ways to think about it. They obviously are targeting different groups of students or different types of programs, like workforce programs, based on their political views. But I don't think, strictly speaking, especially at the municipal level, this is exclusively a partisan issue.
I know that some of this work is being done by Elizabeth Bell, who just was a recent PhD graduate, I want to say of University of Oklahoma, if I'm correct. And now she's going to be a faculty member at Miami. And I know she was looking, I think this was her dissertation work, where she was looking like how do the public support free promise or free college promise programs. And I think it really ranged to depend upon the identity of the particular respondents. I don't want to say anything more than that because I don't remember fully, but I think that is like an area of space that would be interesting for us to kind of do more work around, about how do we speak across the aisle, or how do we get more people interested, excited, and on board with the free college or the promise program movement.
Yeah, and I would echo what everyone is saying. I think the power of these programs is that in general, it can gain bipartisan support, or there is that evidence. Even at the local level, we're working on understanding program implementation at a few different community colleges across the nation, and these are in very red states and red districts, and in very blue districts, and you see kind of the same passion to support students. I think Lisa's differentiation of, some are focused more on workforce development and some are more on student success or equity. That message is there. I think where the politics come in sometimes are just sort of the values behind why having one of these programs. And so you might see pushback maybe at the state level, where people see college promise programs or the message free college is really just a handout to students, and so you may see people trying to make trade-offs or institute different restrictions or eligibility requirements to say, well, we don't want to just offer this for free. People should have to work for these things. I didn't get free college. I had to work for it all myself. You see that sort of rhetoric, and so I think there's just values and beliefs that are sort of that you can see flow into some of the program decisions and designs. And so that's where, if you have a kind of research-based discussion on what we understand about these programs and who you really want to serve, that can hopefully cut across some of those sort of partisan ideas, because there really is, bipartisan support overall.
So one of the questions we often got, because we came up with criteria of like, well, if you want to positively impact equity, you ought to do free college or your college promise program this way. And we had all sorts of ideas. You need to, include 4 years of college. You should cover, the full cost of attendance for low-income students, things like that. And the response we often got was, well, that's a nice idea, but that's very expensive, right? And so there's the funding question. And so the audience definitely wants to talk about that as well. And the bigger question around, like, how are these programs being funded? Is it taxes? Is it state appropriations? Are there examples of, I think Meredith talked about kind of the anonymous donors kind of getting behind the Kalamazoo Promise program, but especially as there's conversation around how do you bring what you see as promising from the local programs to scale, anything that you can offer in the way of funding. What do we know about how these programs are funded, and or any recommendations about how to bring them to scale?
So this also goes into, I think, another researchable question, or something we don't know enough about, is how the implications of different funding models. We know how programs are funded, but certainly not like is using a local city tax better than, some other sort of public-private partnership. We don't really have answers to those questions, but when you look at the full landscape of programs, and I'll focus kind of on the local programs first, you really see a variety of different creative measures. So the anonymous donor type of funding, that is really, really rare. I would say Kalamazoo is very lucky to be in that situation where there, is a wealthy populace that's willing to kind of bankroll this effort. That's very unique. More often, communities have to be really creative, and they're, trying to get different local foundation or some kind of regional or national foundation dollars. They're connecting that with maybe some other sorts of local types of revenue. Sometimes you see a city tax or a county tax being able to support this work, but it's often many different sorts of funding sources that have to be knit together in really creative ways that maybe will work at the get-go, and you see a lot of programs have a lot of energy up front, and everyone comes to the table because, hey, we like this promise idea, we want to support the community. The question is, like, will people have that level of energy? Will a foundation keep doling out that seed money that maybe they were really excited about? So it is really, foundations, other public and private sources. A lot of the community colleges, they're relying on the funds that they generate as an institution. So their institutional foundations are really bankrolling these college promise programs. And so, a lot of credit should be given to, I think, a lot of community colleges that are already pretty under-resourced in trying to direct these dollars, and sometimes that is their only level of funding. They may be able to leverage some other sorts of city dollars, but more often than not, it's that institutional foundation raising that money and deciding we're going to put this to student scholarships. That's at least the trend that I'm noticing.
And so we're at time, but before we close, I'm hoping we can just do rapid fire and run down. So if you all, as the experts, had the opportunity to give advice to a policymaker who's interested in designing a college promise program that works well, that is good for equity, what's the one piece of advice you would give them in like a sentence or less, if that's possible?
So my advice would be it's not just a scholarship program, particularly since a lot of these programs, the last dollar, we need to think of what are some other supports that we can couple with the scholarship program that is really going to help students get through college.
Yeah, Meredith stole mine. So support, right, the panacea, scholarship money is not the panacea. You need to have supports with that. And I think otherwise really ensuring that you're understanding who's being served by the scholarship and doing those sorts of subgroup analyses to make sure your end goal is really what you're targeting, so.
I totally agree. And the other thing I would add is really simple eligibility criteria.
Join me in thanking our panel, please.
So at last count, I think there were 14 unanswered questions on Slido, which tells me a few things. It's a popular technology. We've hit on a really interesting topic. And I hope that people will stick around for our reception from 3 to 4 o'clock, where if you didn't have your question answered, you can seek out the speaker directly. So I would like to invite the speakers on our second panel to take the stage. So if the first was was certainly a quantitative assessment of college promise programs, this next panel we're taking more of a qualitative approach. We're going to hear both directly and indirectly from students about their experiences transitioning to and affording the high cost of college. I will mention that in addition to using Slido, please feel free during the Q&A portion of this panel to raise your hand and use the microphone on your table if you want to go old school. And we'll let Jen Mashori, who's going to moderate this panel, figure out which question to ask first. Jen is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and I will turn it over to her.
Great, thanks so much. Well, I'm actually just going to start by letting the folks on the panel introduce themselves. So Desmond, let's start with you.
My name is Desmond Curtin Jr., current student at Cabrini University, finance major. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Louis Lin, currently a rising senior at the University of Pennsylvania, study public health and education policy, and I'm a first-generation low-income student. That's what most of my work on campus has been around.
Hi, I'm Eileen DeVringy, and if you're thinking I look a little too old to be in college, you are correct. I am a Community Development Research Associate here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia.
Great. Well, we're going to open the panel and hear a little bit about the research that Eileen has conducted, and then I'd like to hear from our students about how that research maybe comports with their experiences, their peers' experiences, what's different, what's the same, and then we can kind of have Eileen jump in along the way and talk about how those then mesh with other research as well. So, Eileen.
All right, so as a primer for our discussion today, I'm going to talk about some research that's been referenced earlier today that I conducted along with my colleagues Keith Wardrop and Kyle DeMaria here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And we've been looking at the Bridging the Gap program at Rutgers-Camden, which Chancellor Haddon spoke to at the beginning of our session today. And essentially, we approached Rutgers-Camden when we first heard that they were announcing the program to say that we wanted to conduct an evaluation. It was right in our backyard. It's in our district. It's an institution that already serves so many students who are underrepresented in college. And so we wanted to learn more about the model and see sort of what lessons can be learned both for the program but for other institutions that are interested in implementing something similar. So part of the reason we felt, just backtracking a little bit, so most of what I'm going to talk about today are interviews that we conducted as part of this evaluation. And part of why we thought it was important to include these interviews is the same reason that we wanted to include this panel in our event today. And that's because it's really essential to get insights on students' experiences, both with College Promise programs specifically, but also their financial lives in general as students, to understand how to design programs that are responsive to those needs. Because we know from the research that the design of these programs really matters for how effective they are. And so knowing kind of students' experiences with these programs is kind of critical to ensuring that you're designing a program that will work for the people it's supposed to work for. So before I get into it, I'm required to give you this disclaimer. The views in this presentation are mine and those of my co-authors. They are not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So I'll start with just a little brief recap of the kind of parameters of the program. So Chancellor Haddon gave you an outline of the program, but just to sort of recap for the purposes of going through our findings. So it is a last dollar financial aid program. So it's coming in after students have their Pell, after they have their state aid, after they have their need-based institutional aid. And it's in order to be eligible for the program, students have to be New Jersey residents. They had to be first-time college students, at least in the first kind of iteration of this program. And also sort of specific to the first iteration of this program, they had to fall into one of these two groups. So I believe in the handout you have in your packets, there's 3 groups now, but when we first initiated the evaluation, there were 2 income groups. So for students coming from households that make $60,000 or less per year, it's essentially kind of what you think of as a free college program. Any remaining tuition after those need-based financial aid sources are applied is waived. And then for students in that $60,000 to $100,000 income range, the half of their unmet tuition costs are waived. So students are automatically put in the program. They just have to complete their FAFSA. There's no additional, you need to fill out an application, you check a box, none of that. And in order to remain eligible for the program throughout their academic careers, they have to maintain good academic standing, which essentially just means, for most programs, a 2.0. But they also have to complete 30 credits per academic year. And this speaks to what Chancellor Haddon was saying about using this program as a way to encourage on-time graduation. With the idea being that 30 credits a year is essentially the typical amount a student would need to take to complete their program in 4 years. So 2016 was the inaugural cohort for this. We plan on following these students for 5 years. So we are currently, I think, going into their junior years. And it's worth noting, and this was referenced in the earlier panel, that there are a number of students at Rutgers-Camden who fall into this, typically the less than $60,000 income range, who are not technically in this program because their combinations of need-based aid are sufficient to cover sort of all of their tuition and campus fee costs. So just briefly on our research plan. So we've been very lucky to work with an institution that really genuinely wants to understand how their program is working, really genuinely wants to use the feedback we give them to make improvements. And I feel very fortunate as a researcher in that regard. And we knew from the outset that we wanted to do a mixed methods research program. So our plan is, as I mentioned, to follow the students through the first 5 years. So far, we've published 2 reports, both of which are available on the publications table back there. And I'm going to very briefly, in a way that I hope will not be duplicative of what we've heard so far, talk about our primary quantitative findings, and then I'll dive into the specifics from the student interviews, highlighting kind of direct quotes from students that we spoke to. So first, and this is something that was very nicely teed up by the first panel, but one of the clearest quantitative outcomes we saw was that the program appears to have boosted enrollment, particularly among students who are in that kind of free college bin, income bin, but also among African American and Latino students as well. And we took this as an indication that sort of in the same vein as prior research, that students are really sensitive to kind of the perceived cost of going to college. And then since we've only looked at programs or outcomes rather for students in the first year after their first year of the program, we don't have a completion indicator or anything like that. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to highlight a composite indicator where we look at whether students were able to meet both of those academic requirements, so maintain at least a 2.0 GPA and complete 30 credits in a year, and then re-enroll in Rutgers-Camden the second year. And so we're comparing students who are in the lower income bin, the middle income bin, and then students who did not have any tuition left over after need-based aid, so not technically bridging the gap participants. We're looking at them compared to similar students from the prior 2 years of school. And so this is an area where the comparison, there are a couple different ways to make these comparisons, right? So I'm very jealous of Alyssa's like very clean randomized control trial kind of experiment as a researcher. We're sort of evaluating this as it unfolds. But essentially one way to think about looking at whether or not the programs had an impact is to compare these students to similar students from the prior 2 years. We do that, we see pretty positive outcomes. So pretty strong increases in the percent of students who met both of those requirements and re-enrolled. But what we also see is that for students in this no tuition gap category, so the ones who are not necessarily receiving a benefit from bridging the gap, they also saw those improvements. And so when we kind of looked into this a little bit more, we found that there are other kinds of enhancements going on at Rutgers-Camden all the time, so improvements in counseling, in course registration policies, things like that, that may have accounted for some of these effects. And so when we did sort of an analysis comparing the relative improvement for students in that lower income bin versus students who didn't have a tuition gap, we found that those improvements were relatively similar. So kind of headline, students are doing better than similar students in the prior years, but we can't say that this is specifically because of bridging the gap. All right, that's all the numbers I'm going to make you look at so we can get into sort of the more, the focus of this panel, which is hearing sort of students' perspectives. So moving on to our qualitative findings, when students were first adjusting to school, we spoke to them in their first semester, and we asked them to reflect on their college application process. And a number of them, probably unsurprisingly, because we were speaking to students who ended up enrolling at Rutgers-Camden, said that the Bridging the Gap program was a major factor for them. So students and their families really responded to this message about college being free or very affordable. And I really enjoyed this quote from a student who was saying that, her grandma heard about it and then wouldn't stop bothering her, which is, it's a testament to how involved a lot of these families are in this decision as well. We heard a lot from students about anxiety around student loan debt, so they're really absorbing this national conversation about that. But also, a lot of them also sort of pointed to particular people they knew in their lives who had struggled with either student loan debt or some other form of debt. And so the second quote here is very kind of illustrative of that perspective. So they don't want to put their family in any more stress and debt. When we spoke to students about sort of the impact that Bridging the Gap has had on their experience in college thus far, a lot of students reported that it's helped them kind of reduce their financial anxiety around college. It's freed up some of the mental bandwidth to dedicate more towards their academics, so more time to study than to think about money. And we heard this a lot from students who actually were in the income categories that make just a little bit too much to qualify for most financial aid programs. So maybe adding just a little bit of complexity to what we've heard so far. Obviously the greatest need is for the lowest income students, but we spoke to a lot of relatively middle income students who had a lot of financial anxiety around college as well, especially students who are coming from households where maybe there's multiple children who are going to end up in college. So at the same time, unfortunately, some of the financial relief that the program offered was sort of undercut by challenges students had with the financial aid system. So the financial aid process, as we've heard, could be the first time that a lot of these students are really navigating a very bureaucratic process, having to advocate for themselves in that process. And at times students found it confusing, and at times students found it, demoralizing. So it's a highly opaque process. And unfortunately, because of some challenges with how the state was processing financial aid, there was a lot of delays in certain aid disbursements, and particularly for low-income students who are sort of disproportionately picked for additional verification. It could already be a challenge for them to get together the information they need to complete these applications. But when you go through the verification process, you have to produce additional documentation, and that can result in delays. That can result in adjustments to your account. So we would hear from students, I got an email saying I owed $375 randomly. I thought I'd paid everything off, as a result of some of the delays in the processing of the state aid, a lot of students didn't necessarily have their financial aid settled until months into the semester, and some of them even into the following kind of spring semester, which is challenging because the costs of semester, or the costs of going to college, are kind of front loaded at the beginning of the semester. That's when you're buying a lot of your books, a lot of your materials. So that's a challenge that I think is worth keeping in mind when you're thinking about the last dollar model, because it is contingent on sort of all of these moving pieces around the federal financial aid and the state financial aid. And ultimately, these discrepancies were totally sorted out, but a lot of students sort of reported feeling like a little bit of mistrust towards the process. So like it's guaranteed, but it's not guaranteed at the same time. So beyond tuition, when we spoke with students, we found that most, if not all of the students we spoke to shared some responsibility for costs kind of that are just day-to-day living in non-tuition educational expenses. So a lot of students were commuter students who have to cover the costs of putting gas in their car, insurance, things like that. And a lot of students also contributed to their household's finances, or would be expected to if there was a financial emergency in their home. In order to cover these expenses, students need to have cash on hand. They need to have some sort of financial flexibility. And they described sort of a patchwork of different strategies for this. So a lot of students use savings from working over the summer, scholarships from their high schools, tax refunds, birthday money, everything you can think of, but also, of course, working during school was a very important way for students to have the cash on hand they needed for these kinds of expenses, and also loans as well. As Alyssa referenced in her presentation, these kinds of costs can become real barriers to persistence in college because students see that as part of whether or not they can afford to be in college. So even though they're kind of relatively low cost when we're thinking about things like tens of thousands of dollars for tuition, they're very present on students' minds. So we heard a lot from students about the challenges of balancing their employment and their school lives. A lot of students who we spoke to sort of continued their jobs that they had been in high school, or assumed that they could continue to work at kind of a similar number of hours per week. but quickly found that their work schedules and their academic schedules, especially with a much more demanding kind of college-level academic expectation, that juggling those time commitments was really difficult. And this was particularly true for students who worked off campus. They had supervisors or managers who weren't necessarily accommodating of their school schedules. They couldn't reduce their hours during finals or anything like that. And in the second year of school, we saw a lot of students sort of step back on that. Those who were able to sort of decided to work less, to stop working, or a number of students switched to on-campus jobs that offered a little bit more flexibility. And for a lot of students, this meant they would have to rely more heavily on financial support from their families, or they would have to take out additional loan money in order to cover some of those expenses that they no longer had the wages to support. But unfortunately, there were a lot of students who didn't really feel like they could make those kinds of trade-offs and still sort of get through their days. So this first quote here sort of illustrates that. I know I have a test, but I also know I have to work because if I don't work, I don't have gas money to make it to school, to take the test, and graduate, right? So that student is in a bind. And I think one thing that that really came through in a lot of these interviews is that students have very heterogeneous experiences. There are some students who are able to seek additional support from their families and are able to scale back on work hours, and there's some students for whom that's just not a possibility. So for a lot of students, there was a real reluctance to take on more debt. There was a reluctance to go and request more from their families. And even some students who we spoke to who had reduced the amount of time they were spending at work or stopped working entirely suggested that if something changed in their family's financial situation, they might be induced to go back to work. So a lot of students are navigating a very kind of financially precarious circumstance. And so when we see that non-academic factors are a major driver of students not completing their degrees, this kind of speaks to that. All right, so moving on to the program requirements. One thing we found particularly in students' first year is that they weren't actually aware of the program requirements. And to some extent, this is sort of a function of the program just automatically enrolling people, like perhaps if they had applied, they would be aware of it. And I'm not advocating for creating an onerous application process, but it's also very common for students to not necessarily be aware of the academic requirements associated with various sources of aid. So while I'm sure that this was communicated to students many times in many different ways, just it got lost in the shuffle of the transition to college. And so students who got to their second semester and realized that they had not been taking enough credits to complete the 30 credits in like a regular academic year, we're in kind of a tough spot. So some of them, if they learned early enough, could load up their schedules and try to make up the difference. Whether or not they're able to do that might depend on, their employment situation. And then others were looking into taking summer classes, and at the time, financial aid was generally not available for the summer term. So they were looking at potentially an out-of-pocket cost that might need to be covered with loans, most likely. But fortunately, Rutgers Camden sort of realized this challenge as they were going into the summer after the first year, and they were able to extend some additional financial aid to students who were at risk of becoming ineligible for the program. And the summer semester sort of in general turned out to be pretty critical for students to be able to get to that 30 credit threshold. So about a quarter of students in the program ended up enrolling in summer courses, and that is a 10 percentage point increase compared to similar students from the prior year. So 10 percentage points, not 10%. So it was a very large increase in the number of students who took summer classes. And sort of subsequent to this, the Department of Education has extended Pell year-round. So this is an option that'll be a little bit more financially sustainable for students in the future. But it's just worth noting that when you set sort of some higher academic expectations, those summer courses can be really critical for making sure people can meet them. All right, so I'm going to wrap up what I think are some of the big takeaways from our research so far. So the first is that students are really responsive to messages around college affordability, right? So when they hear that college is free to them, they will go to there. It was, I think someone in the first panel mentioned, students might not be aware that they can go to college for essentially free just because it's so complicated to figure out exactly how much it's going to cost for you to go to college. that this program, sort of that messaging, really drove that point home for them. Second is that students, especially first-year students, are probably going to need help navigating the financial aid process. But again, a point made in the earlier panel is just navigating sort of the college life in general. And again, for last dollar programs that require coordinating across a bunch of different agencies that are dispersing aid, this is a particular challenge. So in addition to sort of tuition expenses, students need a financial buffer that they can rely on when they have financial emergencies, or even just to cover sort of fully anticipated but still costly things like textbooks and computers and things like that. Due to issues with time constraints and financial constraints, a lot of students are not necessarily able to scale back work hours without taking out additional loans. So there is sort of this trade-off. If you want students to be enrolled in a full course load, they're going to experience sort of a work loan trade-off in order to have the financial resources they need to cover those ongoing expenses. So the summer term, again, really important for enabling students to remain on track for a 4-year graduation timeline. And lastly, understanding and being responsive to student feedback is really important for these programs. So through student feedback, we identified the challenge with students being unaware of the 30 credit requirement, and that enabled sort of the institution to respond in a way that ensured the students would remain eligible. And with that, I'll take it back to the panel.
Great, thanks so much, Eileen. So one of the big benefits that Eileen just talked about that we heard earlier was around this message of free college. And if a program is designed well and there's not a ton of eligibility requirements, or if the message really gets out there, that that clear message can actually reach folks who might not otherwise understand what aid is out there. So I'm wondering if our students here can talk about what you actually knew about college costs when you were thinking about applying to college, what you knew when you did apply to college, and then what was the reality when you sort of enrolled, got your financial aid packages throughout your experience so far, and how those original perceptions then actually matched with what's happened so far.
So I graduated from Morrell Dobbins CTE High School, and we had College Possible to support us. So as far as knowing college costs, out of the 15 colleges we had set up, the ones that I applied to, the 15, we had set up a graph calculating the cost and everything we had to pay for and everything that was taken care of by financial aid, along with Pell Grants and other grants by College Possible, showing us what we have to pay out of pocket, if any. And so that process is pretty easy. I didn't know exactly how much I would have to pay out of pocket until the first day of school, which is still not a problem. And what was the other question?
Well, how it matched the reality. And actually, if you could give a few sentences on College Possible for folks who might not be familiar with the program, I think that would be great as well.
So how it matched the reality? I mean, I know I had to work regardless going to school. I try to take out as minimum loans as possible. Fortunately enough, Cabrini offered a lot along with the other grants. So in total, I had to pay $3,000 out of pocket, which is not much of a problem, and I would say it's worth it. Worth the education I gained so far, at least. And for those of you who do not know what College Possible is a program that helps you get into college for low-income students or any students that is where it's stationed inside of a high school or whatever school is in, and it helps you get through college. So they work with you, more like a resource.
And really quickly, can you talk about, so when you were applying, you said 15 colleges, and they set up a chart for you to figure out what all your options were, and you would sort of compare across, or what did that look like?
Yeah, so I know I wanted to major in finance, and I know I wanted to be in an MBA program. I also knew, like, what I wanted to do. So I went through colleges looking for ones that specialize in what I wanted to do. So College Possible helped me. They put me on websites I never knew existed, scholarship websites I never knew existed, and we went through it like that. And going through the colleges, we marked them down on a graph, how much they cost, what was being taken care of together on a graph out of all the colleges that I got accepted to, which was the 15. And yeah, that's how that process went.
I'm originally from New York, so I'll start off with that. And this was before the New York's free college program began, so keeping that in context. So in that mind, going to an institution like Penn was kind of the way, because going to a state school would have cost even more money because the financial aid that they would have given me would have been less than an institution like Penn. So that kind of limited where I was looking. But that is something when you're looking at cost of attendance or not using net price calculators and seeing, or even the flaws of net price calculators, students may not necessarily understand how much money they will actually have to pay depending on the institution that they go to. So some students may cut out all of these institutions like Penn because they see the high $70,000 price rate and then not even try, even though their aid that they would have gotten would have been able to match that. So that was kind of the context of which schools I tried to apply to.
And how did you figure that out?
How did I figure that out? That was from my mom being like, you have to go to one of these schools because they give you a lot of aid. And even then, my parents didn't go to college, but she had a little book that she would read, and going through would be like, okay, these are the schools that you can get money from. So money was a huge factor. Now that New York State does have some sort of program that allows for free college, that could have changed the possibilities of different people. But as of now, or as of then, that was the path that I was on. Getting into college, some of the things that may have taken people by surprise, especially me, were that coming from school, a place where my insurance was covered by the state, going to Pennsylvania, it no longer applied, and then health insurance is required by the school. How do you make use of these costs, and needing to get onto the school's health insurance, but then not knowing that there's a cost associated with that, and then going to the financial aid office and saying, I can't pay this, can you please give me more aid? That kind of conversation. But things like that weren't necessarily communicated within the whole package, but obviously tuition, room and board, things like that were all talked about and publicized on the website. Things that have changed in terms of expectations since then, with the new tax bill that passed recently, financial aid that isn't covered by tuition, room or board, it gets taxed more. So now my taxes went higher this year because the aid that I was getting from the institution like Penn would not be necessarily untaxed. So things like that aren't necessarily playing out. And then I was selected for verification 2 out of the 3 times thus far. And that delaying the amount of aid that you're going to be getting. So Pell Grants don't necessarily, anything at the federal level, so that'd be Pell Grants, things like Perkins student loans and things like that would not be able to be covered until your verification went through. And at least in our school, we had a little backup in that case. So students didn't get a lot of their Pell Grants until second semester. And that doesn't work out because you will not be able to cover some of the things. But our financial aid office is great in terms of upfronting some of that cost and waiting for that to come in, but it does cause some issues in terms of expectations.
And Eileen, do you want to say a little bit more about some of the interviews you ran in terms of anything you heard about expectations on college costs, and then what surprised students when they got there?
Yeah, so there was a quote that I think I cut at the last minute, but that I really like, where a student was like, I wish textbooks were included in tuition because that's really expensive. So a lot of students, that was probably the biggest thing that we heard coming into their first years, was the expense associated with textbooks. And in the second year, we heard some students sort of taking the risk of just, not necessarily buying the textbook, or trying to feel out if they really needed to, if maybe they could go to the library and get it, or they could borrow it from a friend or something like that. So those kinds of educational costs that are really part of being in college, but aren't necessarily covered by a free college program, were definitely challenging for students in a way they didn't anticipate.
Great. And actually, I think all of you anticipated my second question, which is around non-tuition expenses. So a lot of the conversation and debate around free college programs centers around, well, a lot of these non-tuition costs are actually what cause a lot of the problems, and how are we incorporating those in, which then, of course, relates to the issue of work. And so I'm wondering if Desmond and Louis, you could talk about your own experience working as a student, how you make decisions about how much you work versus how much you can afford not to work, and how that might impact your studies.
Okay, so my first semester, I got a job like close to the beginning, but kind of close to the middle of the semester. My first one was working at UPS, which was very critical. One of my required classes I was suffering in because UPS has like fixed schedules, but at the time that was the quickest job I could have, but I also needed money to pay bills, and bills include living bills. So I couldn't leave right away, but fortunately enough, I did pass that class with a D. Next semester, I got another job, which made it easier, but the hours I was able to work were chicken change compared to what I needed. So, yeah, now that I'm out, I gotta work hard.
There was definitely a change in terms of the jobs that I took along my path, granted, due to some like academic intellectual pursuits that changed within myself. But one of the biggest changes was that my first year I worked as a research assistant at the Children's Hospital, but that was a job that required you to be focused every single second of the day and actually doing things. And that kind of took away time that you could be studying, whatnot. So during my second semester or my second year, I then changed to work at the law library, which allowed me to sit at a desk and do my homework while still doing jobs and then getting paid for doing my homework at that time, but things like that. That kind of the calculations that you need to take to make sure that you're able to balance both, I guess, are adjusted based on how you factor in number of courses you're taking or your academic, non-academic requirements in terms of extracurriculars and things like that.
And I know, Louis, you've worked with a lot of first-generation students, peers on your campus. Do you have other insights from some of your peers in terms of their own work schedules, how much folks are working? And
Yeah. So our school limits us to working 20 hours in federal work in terms of work study jobs. But that being said, there are still students that take non-work study jobs and supplement that 20 hours to make enough money. So things like that may not be anticipated. And in terms of how much you're making, it's given that we're in Pennsylvania, minimum wage is not that high. So then some people may have to go out to get an off-campus job because they might pay more, or the jobs that you look through in work-study funds may not be necessarily what you want to do in the future, but because it pays more than other work-study jobs, you take that job instead. So that's like, there are some jobs that pay a good $13 an hour, which are the jobs that most people flock to first, and then you see what happens after. That's kind of the landscape. There are students that we're in a system where federal financial aid is built into your schedule. So I kind of liked what Chancellor Haddon was talking about in terms of making it a situation where you're not required to work or making that need to be lower because other things are covered. But we are in a system that is built into your financial aid. So in order to get that, you do end up working.
And Eileen, any thoughts from the research you did at Rutgers?
Yeah, so I think a lot of students who switched to on-campus jobs, and we did hear a lot about these tensions. So a lot benefited a lot. I think they were much happier with their on-campus jobs. They had much more flexible employment situations. But yeah, it's definitely a situational thing because a lot of students said they couldn't make as much doing on-campus jobs. So whether or not you can afford to switch to an on-campus job was a factor. And a lot of students are commuters, so a lot of students actually prefer to work closer to their homes because that's more convenient for sort of weekend scheduling and things like that. But I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to use those work-study funds in ways that help students who need to work or feel the need to work do so in a way that is still more accommodating of their class schedules.
And actually, we had a question from the audience about work study and whether or not your research had incorporated any specific questions about that. So it seems like a good time to, if there was anything else on federal work study within your research.
I think that largely covered it. I mean, we didn't necessarily look at it in the quantitative analysis that we did, but we asked students about their employment situation each year that we spoke to them. So we spoke to them in the fall of 3 years so far. And yeah, I think that about covers it, is that the work-study jobs offered more flexibility. And, you know, I was thinking when Lewis was saying that everyone wants kind of the more like passive versus active jobs. Like I remember when I was in college, everyone wanted to be the person who like swiped people into the gym. Like that was the best job. But yeah, so some students were able to find positions that worked for them that way.
And Desmond, you had a couple thoughts.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For those of you who may be taking note, I was a commuter at Cabrini, still am a commuter, and I would say it was definitely worth it. Paying rent versus paying $12,000 on campus, that's very much worth it. And the jobs that I had were not minimum wage, so, and I was still having a hard time, you know, living.
We already talked about this a little bit already as well, but Eileen, in your research, you identified some bureaucratic programmatic glitches. It sounds like some of them were from the federal side and some from the state side, and maybe some from the actual program itself. Can you talk through where those glitches occurred? And then I think would love to hear from Lewis and Desmond. We already heard a little bit about verification, but you know, other challenges on the programmatic implementation side around any of the aid programs that you were benefiting from. But
Yeah, so there were, I think, a couple different things that were happening when students were trying to figure out what was going on with their financial aid. And so one of them was just as documents are processed by these various entities, the amount that students are deemed to be eligible for can change, right? And so when you talk about a last dollar program, it really depends on being able to calculate what those last dollars are. And in some ways, that's a little bit more of a moving target than you might think. So if your federal aid gets adjusted or your state aid gets adjusted and you know, Rutgers doesn't necessarily compensate for it immediately, or, you know, it doesn't, you know, alert somebody in the system that, hey, this needs to be adjusted. Students would see like, oh, I owe like $400 on my account when they had thought that they wouldn't know anything or that they had already covered whatever they needed to cover. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it was that students, it was not necessarily easy to determine if they qualified for all of the aid that they thought they would qualify for going in. So it took a long time to determine whether students were eligible for state aid. And that's the one that I think took into the spring semester. Is there some students who looked like they weren't eligible for state aid and therefore were not going to receive Bridging the Gap because it is contingent on all of these other sources of aid. And so sorting that out was very difficult for some students. And then I think, you know, just kind of first year implementation stuff. Again, we're looking at the very first cohort that participated in this. There's certain things around like eligibility that, you know, are not going to, you're not going to anticipate that someone particular case is going to have to come up and you, like, in responding to that case, make decisions that affect sort of policy. So around like students who are permanent residents versus students who are citizens and things like that, what aid they're eligible for and how much needs to come in to fill the gap for them. So those were major ones, and I think the risk, because I mean ultimately all of these students' accounts were settled in some fashion. But I think the risk is that students will approach the financial aid system with a lot more skepticism and not necessarily see it as something that they can rely on through their financial career. So if they are going through, you know, some financial turmoil, they might not think, oh, well, at least, you know, my college is covered. They might not feel like they can rely on that.
I talked about verification of Pell Grants already, so I'll talk about another aspect in terms of how you design programs with outside scholarships that aren't necessarily given through federal grants or through your university and how those get incorporated into the financial aid package. So at least for us, because outside scholarships are not considered part of the whole university grant system, you end up having that count towards the end of after you get all of this aid, and then what happens is that they take away from your student contribution first, which is great. But if you have an outside scholarship that is higher than your student contribution, then it cuts off from the university contribution, and then that replaces it. Granted, this is a pragmatic approach where you can then allocate that aid to another student, but it is something that students may not necessarily take into consideration when they say, I got this much from X university, and I got this much from my outside scholarship, and I will get X amount of money overall in my financial aid, but that doesn't actually play out because you cut off from your university aid with your outside scholarships. But that policy could be different in various institutions, so that's something to keep in mind. And then I guess another thing would be in terms of costs for things that may not necessarily be built into the system of financial aid, so it's not necessarily kind of bureaucratic, but not really bureaucratic, in terms of things like if you're taking art classes and you need, those tend to have higher costs of photography camera or canvas and things like that that aren't built into the system, and how do you work your way around that to make sure you get the necessary aid?
I'm sorry, I need the question again.
Oh, no problem. Any bureaucratic challenges in accessing your aid? And actually, I would open it more broadly to saying accessing, we talked a lot about some of these other programmatic wraparound supports that might be helpful for students that could go along with financial aid. Any barriers to accessing any of the supports on campus, that maybe you should have been eligible for something, but you couldn't access it along the way?
I would say I chose Cabrini University because I didn't have to deal with much of this in the case.
Fair enough.
But I did ask a lot of questions. I was not afraid to go in the, Cavalry Express or, the area where they have this information available to those who want to acquire it. But as far as getting more money than I could, I have tried at various universities, requesting for more financial aid, of course, because who wants to pay for education? And unfortunately, it was unsuccessful. So yeah, I say that was basically the only barrier as far as questioning and answering. Not much of a problem there.
And you were trying to access more financial aid to pay for some of those non-tuition costs?
Oh, to pay for that tuition cost, because I still had
tuition
a 3,000 balance.
Okay.
And
We had a question here, just going back to some of those non-tuition costs. I see some friends from CLASP in the room who've worked a lot on access to public benefits, so making sure that students can access some of those benefits, like you mentioned health insurance, that you might actually be able to get through Obamacare, for example. Did you get any information about things like publicly available health insurance, for example, or any other benefits that might have helped out along the way in addition to your financial aid?
I think in my case, or most of the things that you learn about are through other students or older students who have gone through the process. And then if you qualify for work study, then you technically also qualify for food stamps. So there's a pathway for a lot of students on campus that actually get food stamps through that. I don't know if it's actually legal for a financial aid office to talk about these things, because I know they also can't help us file FAFSA things or go through things like that because of legal ramifications. So I'm not necessarily sure if that's something that a lot of universities make public, but there are means of learning from other students, but that also requires a lot of institutional knowledge of once one student leaves, who can pass that information on, and issues with that.
excuse me, I am uneducated in this field, so
I'm sorry?
I'm not educated in this
Sure,
field.
no worries. Eileen, did you hear anything about that?
We didn't hear anything specific about that, no.
So just bringing this all together, what was the one thing about paying for school or navigating through school that you wish you knew at the start of your college experience that you know now?
I think going into the process, it was a lot of like, this is a future Lewis problem, and that's not necessarily the right mindset to take things. Granted, a lot of what I did throughout, so my cousin goes to Drexel, and she comes from a situation where her financial familial contribution should technically be lower than ours, but because she's not getting as much aid, she has to pay more and take out more loans. So I can talk about it from that standpoint, because I do think Penn has helped me not have to worry too much about it. But just making sure that you're able to, since it is a situation where you have to pay for get more loans and things like that, but we just don't know how the loan process works. We are entering college maybe 18, 17 for some people, and you're just not educated about these things when you're in high school. So a loan comes by and the institution tells you that this is what it is, and you sign off, but like, what is a subsidized loan and what is an unsubsidized loan, and how do you go about that process? And just, I guess, educating myself just so I can help other people in that sense. Like my cousin, who I had to help her go through what loans to take and what isn't necessarily the best loan to take, because you won't get the necessary interest or return that you'll be making.
So College Possible made sure we were educated in that field, as far as paying, like, we went to the furthest extent to see like what we could get for free, what finances would be given to us to, make sure we got in and out of at least our first year, taking baby steps. So I would say something I wish I knew in the beginning of the year, or maybe before I started, is that I didn't have to do essays for scholarships, because essays are definitely a burden on my behalf.
You both talked a bit about loans right now. We have a popular question up top, which so I was wondering if students could talk about their preferences for loans or not taking out loans. So as you were embarking on your college process, what was your general feeling about student debt, how much you wanted to avoid it, whether or not you thought you'd have to take it on anyway? Kind of talk about that.
All right, so before I started, I didn't think I would have to take out any loans, and I wasn't planning to. Considering I lived off campus, the cost was a lot less, but I can't imagine how much danger I would be in if I did live on campus. So fortunately enough, it was $3K. So I did take out a subsidized. Fortunately, that is a loan that doesn't accrue interest right away, like I'm unsubsidized. So I have time to pay it as I'm paying it off now. So that makes this process a lot easier. Now I'm just waiting for financial aid for next school year to see what that's like.
And for me, I knew that taking out loans was not something that I wanted to do. And the good thing about Penn is that it's all grant-based money, so I didn't have to take out loans. But I am coming from an institution that has the financial resources to do that. I understand that's not something that all schools are able to do. So just keeping that in mind, and that may not be representative of the whole landscape.
And following up on that, it sounds like we had a question here about communication about the aid process, particularly from your universities. And I was wondering how your schools have communicated information about loans, information about aid, what you're waiting to hear about for next year, either the mechanism that they use to communicate or the ways in which they provide that information. Is it the right ways? Is it easily understandable? How is that information flow working for you?
So Cabrini is a bit slow as far as communicating what you may owe. You have to go check and ask your own questions. And as far as help goes in the financial aid sector, you have to go seek that. But they did send out like monthly notices on what your balance was, that kind of thing. But as far as help, just like giving out there, you gotta look for it, and it's not as easy as you would expect being, on campus. So.
And I think that with more and more schools having a focus on first-generation low-income students, there has been a call to action among schools to do more. So I think that's very positively helped our institution. Now have 2 highly aided counselors that only work with students that are considered highly aided, which is a majority of you fit into these 2 categories of your family contribution and the amount of aid that you get, and then therefore you qualify and you have dedicated people to help you throughout that process. So that's something that's very beneficial. There's also just a wealth of other resources now available to these students. But outside of that, I would think that because a lot of the students, some of the students are coming from backgrounds where their parents may not be able to speak English, may not be able to understand some of these things. You're going through this process alone, and you can't necessarily rely on familial help to do any of this aid. So kind of working both to not only help students understand the process, but also to educate parents, whether that be translating your website for financial aid to make sure that other parents are able to understand what's happening. But I think that's a huge part that may be lacking in terms of involving familial outreach into the financial aid process.
And we had a question up top, just to follow up on some of the broader conversation, which is, how much would it take for you not to have to work? If you were going to get a scholarship right now to cover your non-tuition costs, what would it take for you to be able to actually study full time?
I actually don't think I would not work purely because not because of the financial aspects, but for the things that I can say on my resume when I actually apply to jobs in the future. So I think that's an aspect that does need to be taken into consideration, that it's not just necessarily wanting to get enough money to pay for my food, but also that if I work at the law school and I'm pre-law, I can say XYZ, I have experience and kind of work through that. But I mean, in an ideal world, I wouldn't have to work, and then I could do extracurriculars that relate to these things, and then therefore I can put that on something. But you shouldn't do things just for your resume. But that is something that's out there when you come from a lower income background and want to get a job in the future to support your family.
Yeah, I agree most definitely. Even if my school was taken care of, I think I would definitely still work, still go to career and development area to get, like you said, a good resume. Because the purpose of going to college was to leave college, so I definitely want to go to have a nice resume, build a resume while I'm in college. And networking. I can't imagine just going to school and going home. That's not really what I came to college for. I came to make the connections. Now, as far as living at home, I would still have to work anyway. So.
And Eileen, any other impressions about work and its importance in building a career and versus also having to pay for expenses that you heard?
So I just want to say that what we just heard from Desmond and Lewis was also reflected in the first year interviews we did with students. A lot of students, they're not going to stop working either because they get some sort of value out of work. They enjoy what they do. They enjoy their coworkers. And a lot of them, they just, their perspective was like, I'm an adult, I'm going to work. Like, it's not a negotiable thing. I think going back to what I said about students being a very heterogeneous group, right? Like how many students have agency over what type of work they can do, what hours they work, things like that. So I think it's reasonable to expect that students are always going to want to work, but if they can be put in a financial situation where they don't have to in order to avoid, financial catastrophe, then maybe they can make choices that better serve, their future interests or that are just more accommodating of their student lives.
A lot less stress and more focus.
Yeah. I work the night shift from 7 to midnight, and that's not necessarily what I would choose if it was a different situation, so things like that. But not necessarily not working.
In my first semester, I had to work from 11 at night to 4 in the morning, so yeah, it's unfortunate.
And just to tie this a little bit back to the loan conversation. So another quote that just barely didn't make it into the presentation was I was talking to a student who was very reluctant to take out loans and was working probably 35 plus hours a week during the school year. And he was telling me that he had, he was given a Fitbit by his mom for Christmas or something like that. And he was checking how much he was sleeping each night. And he was averaging like 2 hours of sleep a night, like during finals. And that was a situation where, I know there's a lot of anxiety around loans. I know there's a lot of reluctance to take out loans, but, I kind of wish he would take out a small loan and maybe sleep.
Again, we had talked a little bit earlier about some of the supports that go along with some of the Promise programs. I'm wondering if there's any other academic programs that you relied on while you were on campus that were particularly beneficial that you wanted to highlight for folks in the room.
So I entered through Penn CAP, which is our Penn College Achievement Program, and that's where we come in a month early, take classes, get to know the campus, get to know other resources on campus and things like that. And that I credit to a lot of my success at Penn, and I think I would be on a completely different track if I wasn't there for that. And I'm coming back as a peer mentor this coming year to mentor incoming freshmen and sharing and coming full circle kind of thing. And I think that's been a whole wealth of resources and knowledge that I've been able to get. I think the other things that this idea of like diversity versus inclusion, of diversity of having these numbers that you can say and having this wealth of students on campus, but then what is happening on campus in terms of inclusion and how resources are inputted. So if a lot of students are coming from communities of color, do you have the cultural resource centers on campus that are able to support these students when they get to campus? And I think that like Patch, which is the Pan Asian American Community House, has given me a lot of those resources. So I think thinking outside of the box of necessarily just advising and a career services office, but those kind of more cultural and support networks and things like that, that should also be emphasized within programs.
I tried to join, I did join like 4 different clubs my first semester, but I had to make sacrifices, so the clubs were the first to go, unfortunately.
I have 2 more questions. If you were going to make one big recommendation to either a state or federal policymaker about how to design a financial aid program well, what would you focus on? Start there and go down. You can start with Eileen if it looks like Desmond.
Sure. So I would say my recommendation would be that schools, states, whoever is setting sort of the parameters of the program, should be really thoughtful about the academic requirements that they attach to them. And, I definitely understand, and certainly in some, political context, there needs to be a sense that like, oh, this is requiring a certain level of achievement. This is incentivizing a certain level of achievement. But when you put academic requirements on financial aid, essentially you're raising the stakes for students who need that aid. And that's fine. Some students will be really motivated for that, but you need to ensure that you're creating opportunities for students who are going to struggle, either because, they came from high schools where they were underprepared, or, they're working so much that they can't be successful in all of their classes. You need to create opportunities for them to have a meaningful chance of actually achieving those academic standards. So whenever you layer on, academic standards, there needs to be additional supports or additional options for students.
I think there are obviously a lot of things that can be done. This was actually a paper that I wrote for Dr. Perna's class a while back, but in terms of how we structure our on-campus financial aid things that are gone through the government, so that being Perkins loans, supplemental education opportunity grants, and other like work study things that are tied to it. The way that it's structured, it's not necessarily bad, but there are institutions that already have been in the program for so long that then get more resources, and that kind of that generational wealth that continues, and then schools that may not have as many resources that don't get as much money from these federal government grants. So like Penn is an institution that, yes, it's great that we get a lot of SEOGs. We probably have the money in our endowment to cover that, and that money could be given to universities that don't necessarily always have that financial resource. So kind of the restructuring of how money is divided and given up to different communities and different schools.
I would say take more in consideration. Even though it may be a hard job and maybe a different way to do this, and this is kind of raw, but research on like areas from which the students are attending from, especially the commuters, because I didn't work on campus for the fact that it was minimum wage. That wasn't going to cut it. So the area that I lived, I worked there and I worked close to my school. So that wasn't, much of a benefactor, but I still got by. And again, there's still much to be paid. So I would say take in consideration of that, and also costs of food on campus, because I looked at like a couple colleges meal plans, or not just meal plans, but the cost if you pay every time you go, ours is definitely higher than our next door neighbors at Eastern. It's ridiculous, like double. Yeah.
My last question for both of you is, what do you want to do when you graduate?
I want to be a professional stockbroker and investor. Yeah, that's the basis of it. Can't give everything away.
And I want to go into public health and education, working in school health, like school infrastructure, school lunch programs, and things like that.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us.
I'd like to thank one more time Jen and Eileen, but especially Desmond and Lewis for sharing their knowledge and experiences with us. So it is time for lunch. You can grab some food in the hallway. I just ask that you bring it back and be in your seats by 12:45 when we'll start our luncheon keynote. Thank you.
I say we do. Laura and I are going to do one thing. Okay. You're a good millennial. Are you a millennial? Who's your class? Yeah. Right. Oh, that's the solution.